Wind hammered the windows, and the house groaned like a ship at anchor. Inside the operations room at Southwick, the cigarette smoke hung low, and the charts along the wall showed a rough gray sea. Shoes squeaked on damp linoleum. A young officer shut the door and rain hissed against the glass again. The men around the table already knew what they wanted to hear and feared what they were about to be told. It was the night of June 4th into the early hours of June 5th, 1944, and the largest invasion force in history sat packed into landing craft and transports from Cornwall to the Thames, ready to go, ready to turn back, and entirely at the mercy of the weather. The plan hinged on a narrow set of conditions. Airborne troops needed a moonlit night to find the drop zones behind the beaches. The assault waves needed a dawn low tide to reveal mines and obstacles driven into the sand. Those two demands overlapped for just a few days in early June. After that, the next workable moon and tide combination wouldn't come until later in the month, and every day of delay carried risk. Discovery by German patrols, mechanical breakdowns, infections in cramped holds, and a slow leak of morale. The American, British, and Canadian armies were staged. The question was simple and brutal. Could they cross on time without the Channel beating them to pieces? Group Captain James Stagg, the Scottish meteorologist coordinating a team from the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, and the U.S. Army Air Forces, men who disagreed about almost everything but the pressure lines on a map, stood in front of the wind and pressure plots. Data arrived from weather ships strung into the North Atlantic, from Iceland stations, and from aircraft that had punched out into ugly air to take measurements. Stagg's voice was calm, the way a pilot is calm when the altimeter starts to sink. A series of low-pressure systems were marching in from the Atlantic. The Channel was already rough, and a full gale was building. The invasion had been scheduled for June 5th. Crews had loaded landing craft. Airborne pathfinders had chalked faces and checked static lines. Minesweepers were ready to cut channels through the minefields offshore. In the meeting, Admiral Bertram Ramsay worried aloud about what a forced delay would do to ships jammed in narrow assembly areas. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, whose fighter cover depended on usable ceilings and visibility, doubted that his pilots could do their job in the morning soup Stagg described. General Bernard Montgomery wanted a quick decision either way. The armies had been living at full extension for days. Stagg recommended postponement. Dwight Eisenhower listened and chose safety for that dawn. The order to stand down rippled out into the darkness. Landing craft pulled back from rendezvous points. Pilots took their hands off throttles they had been holding like lifelines. Men who had tied good luck charms to their gear crawled into wet berths. On shore, the wind rose into a steady roar, and the rain came in sideways, hammering the Channel and slamming doors across southern England. If the fleet had gone, it would have met walls of water and cloud down on the deck. That much was clear. What wasn't clear, what couldn't be, was whether a usable break would open before the tide windows closed. The next conference met in the small hours of June 5th. Men arrived with damp collars and red eyes. Stagg's team had watched the lows march and seen a narrow ridge of higher pressure beginning to press in behind them. It would not clear the sky, it would not deliver calm, but it might loosen the wind and lift the ceiling enough for bombers and fighters to work. Late on June 5th and into June 6th, the Channel might offer a small mercy. Rough but crossable seas, low cloud but flyable air. The window would be short. If they missed it, the invasion would slip to mid-June at best, and secrecy would bleed out of the ports. Eisenhower asked questions no forecast could fully answer. Would the waves capsize the smaller landing craft? Could the airborne go at all with broken cloud and winds aloft? Lee Mallory still worried about casualties among the paratroopers if they scattered. Ramsay ran through tides, minesweepers, and the difficulty of reforming an armada twice. General Walter Bedell Smith, the Chief of Staff, pressed Stagg for confidence levels. Stagg would not promise what he could not know, but he held his ground. A brief improvement was coming, enough to try. Just before dawn on June 5th, after a long pause, Eisenhower authorized the attack for June 6th. He knew what that meant. Thousands of small decisions locked in behind his single word. Minesweepers started out to clear the approach lanes under low cloud. Troop ships came alive as engines turned over and anchors came up. The airborne operation moved to the front of the clock. By late evening on June 5th, pathfinders would jump into Normandy to mark landing zones, followed by the 82nd and 101st Airborne on the western flank and the British 6th Airborne on the east. Every officer who read the order understood that the weather would not be good, only better than the day before, and maybe better than the day after. The weather that morning proved exactly that. Marginal, punishing, but survivable. The seas in the channel ran high enough to make half the force seasick. Some tanks launched in amphibious guise slid off into water they couldn't handle and vanished with their crews. Low cloud and smoke spoiled bombardment timing on parts of the front, and aircraft struggled to hit strong points. At Omaha Beach, where bluffs, currents, and defended draws made the worst combination of the day, the first waves took catastrophic losses. But ships kept coming, and men kept pushing through breaks in wire and over shingle. On Utah Beach, the current carried the first waves off target, and a general landing in the wrong place chose not to pull them back. They moved inland and did their job. British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, fought through concrete and fire to seize the coastal road network. Out on the far edges, British airborne troops held the Orne bridges and silenced the Merville battery, while American paratroopers blocked crossings that the German counterattacks would need. On the other side of the lines, German commanders had read a different sky. Without access to the long-range Atlantic data carried by Allied weather ships and patrol aircraft, their forecast offices expected the storm to persist. Naval patrols stood down in some sectors. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who believed the invasion must be destroyed on the beaches before Allied air power and numbers told, left for Germany to see his wife on her birthday and to press Hitler again for armored reserves closer to the coast. Other senior officers attended a war game away from the front. When radar and coast watchers began to report a massive armada, it took hours for a clear picture to form and longer for permission to release panzer divisions held under Hitler's direct control. The weather that made flying difficult for the Allies also kept the Luftwaffe from striking the beaches in strength. Clouds that hurt helped. By evening on June 6th, a patchwork of lodgements stretched across Normandy. The cost had been enormous, especially at Omaha, where the tide advanced over bodies and ruined craft. Yet the foothold was real and growing. If the assault had run on June 5th into the teeth of the gale, the outcome might have been different. If it had been delayed to mid-June, the brief storm that exploded on the 19th, strong enough to wreck the American artificial harbor at Omaha, might have smashed the invasion while it was still fragile. The choice to go on June 6th threaded a needle the size of a weather window. The gamble belonged to thousands, from petty officers with chafed hands on wheel spokes to glider pilots landing in poppy fields. But it was anchored in one room with barometers, pencils, and maps. Stagg's caution, the pooling of British and American forecasting methods, and the decision to trust imperfect improvement over certain disaster all added up to an hour on a calendar. It is easy to smooth that hour into inevitability now. It did not feel inevitable to the men who signed their names to it. In the years after the war, the story of the weather decision became a lesson in judgment under pressure. Forecasting has improved beyond what those officers could imagine, but the channel remains the channel, and windows remain windows. The invasion's success depended on steel, training, deception, and courage. Yet all of it hung for a moment on cloud height, wind over wave, and a commander willing to live with uncertainty. That morning, the rain eased just enough for ships to make their lanes, and for paratroopers to find dark hedgerows. The barometer rose a fraction. The gamble paid. At Southwick House, the maps still exist. Outside, the wind off the Solent can feel raw even on a summer day. If you stand there and think about the armada that slid out between squalls, 5 beaches, thousands of vessels, and young men crammed shoulder to shoulder, you can hear the scrape of chairs in a room at 2 in the morning and a meteorologist's measured voice saying, there might be a break. Somewhere between storm and calm lay the hour that opened the road to Paris and then to the Rhine. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.